What is up, Scream Team? Zach Cherry here, and in this video, we're gonna analyze Stab, the film franchise within the Scream franchise, and how its legacy has not only defied all logic and continuity, but also why it's just really overrated and actually causing more problems for the writers than anything else. Keep watching to find out exactly why Stab is bad for Scream, and make sure to subscribe to the channel with those bell notifications set to all. That way, you can stay up to date with all my future horror content. For anyone needing a refresher, the Stab movies were a component introduced in Scream 2 that was originally based on the Gale Weathers book The Woodsboro Murders, which depicted the events that had occurred in the previous Scream movie. This started out innocently enough as a shot-for-shot retelling of the original, which reinforced Scream's meta-commentary, but ultimately landed on the spectrum of full-on satire by creating a mise-en-abîme effect within the franchise, as each new Stab movie would need to reference the fact that in and of itself, it exists as its own world outside of a film franchise on which it's the basis of. To elaborate on this, every in-universe Stab franchise would need to depict its own version of the Stab franchise, which in turn would also have a Stab franchise within its universe, creating an endless trail of movies within movies within movies.
You're overthinking it.
Am I, or did whoever make it just underthink it?
At first, the franchise had only depicted the events shown in Screams 1 and 2, but as no real-life Ghostface murders had occurred after the release of Stab 2, the in-Scream universe Sunrise Studios had greenlit a third movie that was entitled Stab 3: Return to Woodsboro, which was an entirely new premise not depicting any sort of real-life events. This is obviously the movie production, which we see the behind the scenes of in Scream 3, where it's revealed that Jennifer Jolie, who played Gale Weathers in the first two Stab movies, was the only actor to return to their role. However, that version of Stab 3 never came to fruition, as its director Roman Bridger ended up murdering his entire cast as the Ghostface killer. This significantly altered the premise of what the eventual movie would become, as just like the previous Stab entries, this threequel would also be a screenplay adaptation of a Gale Weathers book, this time using material sourced from Hollywood horror, which is based on the events seen in Scream 3. That means that since Jennifer Jolie had died in real life, Stab 3 would have recast the role of Gale Weathers, as well as create and cast the role of Jennifer Jolie, presenting a paradox within the trilogy, as the original actress who played Gale Weathers would now be a character in and of herself.
You know, in the movies, I play you as being much smarter. And as a sane person.
Since there were no real-life Ghostface murders during the 11-year gap between the events shown in Screams 3 and 4, the studio opted to make 4 new Stab movies based on original content. And while you may think this would have simplified the franchise, as it no longer had to rely on true crime and the need to depict more movies within movies, they still found ways to disrupt all logic by making Stab 5 about time travel, while Stab 7 shows us that it existed as a movie outside of Stab 6, kind of like Wes Craven's New Nightmare in relation to the first 6 Nightmare on Elm Streets. As of Scream 5, it is stated that there have been a total of 8 Stab movies, with the latest entry being a complete reboot of the franchise, with no apparent ties to anything that came before it. And since there already were 7 in-Scream universe entries at the time of the events depicted in Scream 4, we should know that that means there was never a sequel produced that depicted the events shown to us in that movie, meaning that Jill Roberts never even got to be immortalized on screen as a Ghostface killer. This could likely be attributed to Scream 4's deleted epilogue, in which both Sidney and Gale showed apprehension in writing a book based on their own separate accounts, as it would likely put them in direct competition of one another, underscoring the unresolved tension between them from earlier on. No matter which way you spin this though, the continuity still presents a glaring paradox with the actual number of sequels, as Wes declares in Scream 5 that he'll likely be a target of the new Ghostface killer, since his mother, Sheriff Judy Hicks, was a character in one of the Stab movies. In that regard, I think it's more likely that Scream 5's writers simply just fudged the continuity by classifying the latest Stab entry as the 8th installment rather than the 9th, seeing as how if Jill and Charlie's murder spree were to be adapted into a movie, it would have been the next in line after Stab 7. As the Stab franchise timeline goes from Stab 7 directly to the reboot, it makes it impossible for Judy to have ever been a character in any of the movies. In addition to that, Ghostface proclaims that Sidney Prescott appeared as a character in all 7 Stab movies prior to the reboot, which, according to dialogue spoken by Jenny Randall at the beginning of Scream 4, would present another paradox since it was already stated that Sidney only appeared in the first 3 Stab movies, which were based on true events.
Sidney Prescott's character has been gone since Stab 3.
Sidney's in every movie but the last one.
But then she threatened to sue them if they used her story, so then they just started making stuff up.
This makes sense, since as a real person, Sidney would not own the rights to the story of her life, meaning that anything that happened to her in relation to Ghostface killings is considered to be in the public domain and not actually protected by any intellectual property rights. Therefore, a book or movie could conceivably be made depicting these events, as long as they mostly stick to the facts. As it's mentioned that Sidney threatened to sue the studio if they continued a storyline with her in it, this lets us know that she wouldn't have appeared in any more sequels, since any use of her character outside of real-life events would be a direct violation of her personality rights. Same thing goes for Judy Hicks in any stories not based on Scream 4. However, in terms of how the studio was able to get away with using her as a character in Stab 3 Return to Woodsboro, clearly based on an original screenplay, it's implied that Sidney would have signed a release with them in exchange for a sizable monetary settlement, which explains why at just 22 years old, she's able to afford a large secluded property hidden deep in the scenic California countryside. So with all of that in mind, how did the Stab franchise become so confusing, and why did the characters in Screams 4 and 5 act like it's the most influential thing to ever happen to the horror genre? Let's roll it back a bit here. Stab is hardly the masterpiece that Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson's Scream was set out to be. It's poorly acted with cringe-worthy dialogue and features over-the-top theatrical cues such as a dramatic lightning storm and gratuitous shower scene, all which culminate in making it more of a statement on the inferior tropes the horror genre is often criticized for. In fact, you could look no further than Randy's own contemptuous attitude towards it.
I'll wait for video.
Stab is, and always was, presented as being nothing more than a really bad horror movie version of Scream. Therefore, it's unlikely to feature the same introspective writing and self-reflexive characters, and certainly doesn't possess the skillful direction that could only come with Wes Craven's horror movie pedigree.
Oh, but you will sit through a movie called Stab.
Obviously, as we found out in Scream 4, Wes Craven didn't even direct Stab or any of its footage, as Robert Rodriguez served as a second unit director to complete all of the Stab sequences, which again was more so an inside joke to add to the meta commentary of the Scream movies, since Rodriguez is an accomplished director in his own right, whose talent far exceeds the schlocky presentation we see in Stab. But if anything, that only adds to the fact that Stab is basically just a dramatic reenactment of true crime that astoundingly avoided being a Lifetime TV movie by earning itself a major theatrical release. In simpler terms, Stab was merely made to be in the same image of Scream, but not actually possess any of its DNA. In that regard, it's unlikely it would have ever taken off as this huge hit that redefined the horror genre, and if art truly does imitate life, it's even less likely that after 3 real-life stories had been adapted, that it would have ever received 5 more movies based around its premise. So that then begs the question, how exactly did the Stab franchise become this long-standing pop culture linchpin within Scream's 25-year timeline? The reason for this oversight may actually be credited to Scream 3's production, in which Kevin Williamson was unable to return for full-time screenwriting duties, and instead was commissioned to submit a 30-page treatment for the studio's consideration. In this treatment, the story had nothing to do with a continuance of Stab movies, and would have rather focused on Sidney returning to Woodsboro Colorado, where she would then face off against a cult of Ghostface killers who were being mentored by a still living but incarcerated Stu Macher. This idea was eventually kiboshed by studio head Bob Weinstein, who insisted that the third chapter be set in Hollywood, as he considered that to be the best and most natural evolution for the then trilogy, hence the need to double down on the movie within a movie concept. Screenwriter Aaron Kruger was hired in place of Williamson and made to write a script based on this premise with little to no knowledge of the two chapters that preceded it. This explains why the Stab franchise is featured so heavily in Scream 3, despite the fact that it was more of an afterthought in Scream 2, only appearing in the opening scene, a subsequent clip featuring Tori Spelling, and part of the discourse shown to us in the film class with Mickey, Randy, and Cece. That's not to say that the Stab movies were never meant to be an integration into the Scream sequels, as Sydney even foreshadows her character's casting in the original. However, it was certainly never meant to be the driving force behind the franchise's narrative 5 films in, as Scream always started with a simple mission statement that movies don't create psychos, movies make psychos more creative. In that regard, Williamson's writing was more focused on paying homage to the horror genre as a whole, and never meant for the idea of Stab to be anything more than a gimmick to call attention to the meta aspect of the Scream series. Take each film's opening scene, for example. Although the concept of the girl receiving harassing phone calls while being at home is now a trademark more synonymous with Scream, it was actually influenced by 1979's When a Stranger Calls. However, this was never meant to be the centerpiece of each successive entry, since for the opening scene of Scream 2, Williamson instead chose to draw inspiration from the 1980 horror flick He Knows You're Alone, which saw a murder take place in the middle of a crowded movie theater, while its characters too were watching a horror movie on screen. Williamson had also written the original screenplay for Scream 4, yet once again it was heavily changed by producer Bob Weinstein, and an entire opening scene which would have featured Sydney and her associates being attacked during a dinner party was ultimately excised from the story. Scream 4's finished product did receive its own unique spin on the opening scene tradition, but you'll notice that just like Scream 3, and especially with Scream 5, it once again plays off of that familiar When a Stranger Calls concept. Obviously, this particular tradition has become ingrained within the mythos of the Ghostface character, as it's now expected to appear in every movie as their calling card, and who could fault them for that? It's clearly a formula that is shown to be tried and true, and Roger L. Jackson delivers as the iconic voice on the phone. Having said that, it does draw attention to the franchise's repetition and lack of originality, especially when you consider that the scene was already done to perfection with Drew Barrymore in the 1996 original. What's even more baffling is the fact that the horror genre has offered us a deep well of content to mine from that dates back a full century, and yet here we are, every Scream sequel hitting the same beat over and over again. And you know why that is? Because of the precedent set by the Stab franchise, which prioritizes self-referentialism above anything else. In that way, Stab represents all of the bad decisions made in Hollywood, as its continued influence not only highlights a reliance on repackaging nostalgia, but also the remnants of a legacy left behind by an overzealous producer over 20 years ago. Scream is brilliant because it's a horror movie that exists in our reality, and therefore has access to all of the other horror movies that exist to us. With the advent of Stab, the lines of that reality are blurred, and the meta commentary shifts into a more narrow perspective, in which the only callbacks being made are now entirely to itself, thus negating the synergy that was present when we shared the same universe with Scream. This is essentially where the division lies, and why the Scream sequels kind of lost sight of the bigger picture. But I digress, because this is not a video to highlight any diminishing returns, as the quality of this franchise is still way more consistent than any of its horror contemporaries. However, there is always the danger that it could suddenly hit a wall, and we might finally get that one entry that is truly and utterly abysmal. In that regard, the Scream franchise's unnecessary reliance on stab could be compared to Halloween, and how for years that franchise was tethered to the idea that Laurie Strode was actually Michael Myers' younger sister, reshaping the masked killer from his original inception of being evil incarnate to nothing more than a vessel of a druid curse in a ridiculously convoluted plot that saw him only interested in killing off members of his own family. Like Stab's inclusion in Scream, this was an idea that was never part of the original story, and after being introduced in the first sequel, became the driving force behind each new entry, Season of the Witch notwithstanding, until the franchise was forced to reboot itself no more than 3 times after each new thread of continuity eventually meandered into a dead end. In the same way, this is where I believe Scream's continued focus on Stab franchise crossover could ultimately hurt the integrity of its long-lasting success, as the stories for the last 3 movies have heavily relied on their relationship with the fictional in-universe franchise. That's not to say that these Stab movies haven't been relevant within the context of each respective entry, as there has been a thematic pattern to them all along. Scream 2 was a statement on sequels, Scream 3 on trilogies, Scream 4 on remakes, and Scream 5 on childhood nostalgia, but where does it go from there? With Scream 6 already deep into production, a mere 7 months after Scream 5's release, it doesn't feel like enough time has passed in the cinematic zeitgeist to uncover a brand new horror trend to serve as the next chapter's theme. And if the Stab franchise's only purpose is to serve as an entry point to the film's subtext, any unnecessary inclusion of it would just feel like excess baggage at this point. However, while several retcons of Halloween's story yielded a fractured timeline in that franchise, a similar recalibration for Scream wouldn't be as grievous, as it isn't as beholden to its reliance on the Stab movies as Halloween was on its sibling connection between Michael and Laurie. This may present Scream with a very simple solution, as all it has to do is just no longer acknowledge the Stab movies outside of the fact that they do exist within the already established canon. This even feels like it would be a logical progression, given the fact that Scream 5 concluded with Gale stating that she would no longer be writing any more books based on Ghostface, therefore omitting the source material used to adapt their stories into any future screenplays. In whatever way Stab continues to live on within the Scream franchise, I think we can all agree that it's mostly been played out, and the best way to move forward is to go back to the original. Not in the way that the movies have been, by riffing on the same ideas that have already been done, but in the way that Kevin Williamson had initially approached the writing. After all, if you want to make a really good scary movie, all you gotta do is watch a few of them and make sure to take plenty of notes. Just ask Stu. I want to thank a few of my Patreon supporters like Nathaniel Fincher, Tevin Jackson, Garrett Atkins, Kyle Beard, and Mehmet Z. If you guys want to check out even more Scream-related content, you can click on either one of these playlists. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.